Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to talk you through a real game, and I'm playing a relative beginner, someone who's rated 1400 in Blitz but just 595 in Rapid Chess, and we are playing a 60-minute game. So that will hopefully give me time to talk about the moves, talk about the choices, but more importantly to help you to get into the mindset of how to think about chess and how to win at chess. Okay, so we've had the first move. I started, because I was white, I started with pawn e2 to e4. Black has responded by playing knight here to f6. Now, as you can see, because of the way that knights move, that knight is now attacking that pawn, and I currently have no pieces defending it. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to either move that pawn forwards, which I may do, or defend the pawn. So one way of defending it would be to move my light squared bishop out to d3 where it defends it. However, that could be a problem because it's blocking off. If my bishop's there, it's blocking off this pawn. And generally what you want to be doing at the start of a chess game is to get your middle pawns, the central pawns, towards the center of the board, because these central squares are the most important. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to defend my pawn with my own opposite knight. So Black's moved his f knight out, sorry, the g knight from g1 to f6. I've moved my b knight from b1 to c3. So now this knight is defending that pawn. If his knight were to capture, then I would capture his knight. So I would lose a pawn. Pawns are generally described as being worth 1 point in terms of material. But knights and bishops are worth 3, rooks are worth 5, queens worth about 9. Okay, so Black has now responded by playing pawn to d5. So now there are 2 pieces attacking my pawn and only 1 piece defending it. So again, I have options. I can try to introduce another defender. So for example, pawn to d3 would defend the pawn, but that would have an issue which it would block off this route for my light square bishop to get into the game. Pawn to f3 is a possibility, but that's a bad idea because it opens up a diagonal towards my king. So the queen might jump out at some point there to h4 and attack my king. So I think what I'm going to do in this situation is I'm going to push the pawn forwards to e5, where it is now attacking the knight. So the tables have turned a little bit. And then what I'm thinking now is that if I can then play d2 to d4, then my d pawn will be defending my e pawn. What has to happen now is that the knight has had to move. Okay, I've forced the knight to move because I'm attacking it with a lower value piece, and this is described in chess as losing a tempo. Tempo is just Italian for time, so you lose time. If your opponent forces you to do something and then you have to react and play a move that maybe you didn't want to play, then that can it loses you time, and it means that you are 1 move behind developing your pieces and getting the game started from your perspective. Okay, so Black has moved his knight here to h5. Now I notice that is on the diagonal with my queen. So my queen could come out and capture that knight. Okay, I'm not going to do that right now. I mean, normally in a normal game I would, but that's going to make the game probably too short. So I'm going to carry on with my plan and play d2 to d4. Okay, so I now have these 2 nice pawns in the center of the board. Something it always makes sense to think about in chess is to try and visualize all the pieces, all the squares on the board that your pieces are controlling. Okay, and there are usually quite a lot of them. And then I've got this bishop that's controlling that and that. Okay, I'm not going to do this all the time. Then this bishop is controlling, oops, okay, pressed it wrong, right? But all, yeah, and if he moves, then all my things disappear. Okay, so he's realised that his knight was there, could be taken, and the chess term for that is empris, means it's can be captured. So black has played pawn g7 to g6 to defend the knight. Now, if my queen were to capture that knight, then I would get a piece worth 3 points, but then the pawn would recapture on h5, and I would lose my queen, and you really don't want to lose your queen. Your queen is the most valuable piece. So, capturing that knight right now is not an option. One thing I could do is maybe bring my light squared bishop here to e2, where I've now got a barrage. Let's play that move. Okay, so now I've got two pieces actually attacking that knight. Right? So my bishop could capture the knight. Then if the pawn recaptures and takes my bishop, bishops and knights are generally roughly equal in value. They're both generally worth about 3 pawns, 3 points. So if my bishop takes, and then the pawn takes my bishop, and then the queen can recapture, then I've won a pawn. Okay, I've captured a knight and a pawn, and I've lost one bishop. So let's go ahead and do that. And the pawn recaptures. There you go. So you can see pawns. That's how pawns capture on that diagonal. And now my queen can come in and capture the pawn. And what's interesting is that this also comes with check. You could tell there's a different sound played by chess.com, and that means that check has just happened. Okay, so black has to get out of check. Right? Now, there are a few different ways of doing it. One way is to capture the piece that's put you in check, if you can do that. That's not possible in this case. Another option would be to block the check by putting a piece in the way, but this rook can't do that, and this bishop can't do that, because the two squares between my queen and the king are actually light squares, and this bishop is a dark squared bishop. It can't go on light squares, ever. So the third option is moving the king out of the way. Right. Now, so I have a slight advantage at this point in the game. My opponent has been forced to move his king. Now, when you have moved your king, you then forfeit the right to castle. You then cannot do the castling move at any point in the game. So, what I need to think about is, I want to make my own king safe. I want to occupy the middle of the board, but primarily at this point. So I'm not thinking about attacking, and I'm not thinking about winning the game at this point in time. I do always want to be aware of the material on the board. Are there any pieces of mine that could be taken and captured? Are there any pieces of my opponents that could be captured? But more than anything else, I want to castle my king, get my king safe. So, in order to castle, it means that you have to develop, which means to get your pieces off the back rank. Okay, you have to develop your minor pieces, or all the pieces that are between the king and one of the rooks. Okay, so my light square bishop has already gone. Okay, that's off the board now. So I have one piece here which is in the way of castling on this side, and I have also one piece on this side that needs to move if I'm going to castle on the queen side of the board. So generally this half of the board really is known as the king side, and the opposite half is known as the queen side. Okay, so files A, B, C and D are the queen side, and E, F, G and H are the king side of the board. So I need to be thinking now, which side do I want to castle on? And I'm thinking that there's an open file here now because my opponent's G pawn has been removed. So this rook could come to G8 at some point, and then it's looking right down at here. So if I was to castle kingside, my king would go to g1 and this rook would go to f1. My king would then be in the line of fire of that rook potentially. So I'm now thinking I'm going to castle on the queen side of the board, which means king to c1, and then the rook jumps across to the other side of the king to d1. Okay, so that means I need to remove this bishop, and in order to do that I think I might move it to f4 would be a good place, or even e3. Let's try that. Okay, so I've moved my bishop and I'm getting ready to castle. I also have a nice piece of chocolate cake and a cup of tea, because one of the things, I go on about this a lot, right? You need to take your time with chess. So my opponent has just played a move, right? My opponent has just done something. They've captured the pawn on e5. Okay, now really critical, and I'm going to take a bite of cake as I think about this. Okay. So what you have to do, every time your opponent makes a move, you have to say to yourself, what has changed? Okay. What is now weak that wasn't weak before? What can now be captured that couldn't be captured before? Is there a new threat to me? Has this weakened my position? You have to ask yourself, what has changed and why did my opponent make that move? Okay, so he's just captured a pawn. I could recapture at this point in time. So I could recapture this pawn with my queen, or I could recapture it with my d pawn. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture it with my queen, because if my queen takes it on e5, look, that comes with a threat, because queens can move diagonally as well as straight lines. So my queen from here will now be looking at black's rook on h8, and let's see if black notices this threat. I'm still intending to castle, which means king would go to c1 and my rook would jump across to d1. And it's nice to get your rooks in into the middle at the end of your development. So this castling does a few things. I mean, putting the king on c1 makes it a little bit safer. The edges of the board tend to be have less activity than the middle of the board. And the other thing is that it puts this rook on d1, where it now can influence the board a little bit. So if my rook is here, it's looking at more squares. I mean, right now, at the start of the game, rooks are pretty useless. You know, they're just looking at the back of a pawn, and they're blocked in by this knight to the side. So they control very little of the board. But as the board opens up, rooks can get a lot more active. So my opponent's having a good think here. I'm hoping that they've noticed the threat on the rook there on h8. So what he needs to be thinking about is protecting this rook. Now, one option might be to move the bishop there to enable the queen to defend the rook, but the problem with that is that my queen could just capture the bishop there. So what he's doing is he's doing a counter attack instead. All right. So he's attacking he's developed his b knight to attack my queen, but what he hasn't realized is that this rook is en prise. It can be captured. Also, this pawn on d5 is en prise and can be captured. So I'm going to ignore the rook for now. I'm going to capture the pawn, and that comes with check, because the king is now in danger. The king could be captured on the next move. Therefore, the king has to move, or we have to capture the queen, which isn't possible. There's no piece that can capture the queen right now. Or something has to block this square, but there is no piece of black's that can block that square right now, not in one move. So the king there is only one legal move now. The king is going to be forced to move back to e8. in doing this move as well, of course, my queen has got out of trouble. The knight was attacking it there on e5 by capturing the pawn. I'm not only putting my opponent in check, but I'm getting my queen safe at the same time. Okay, so now my queen is now facing off with his queen now. So let's say if I take his queen and he recaptures either with a knight or with a king, that's called an exchange. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're exchanging queens. And technically it's with check, so there we go. He's recaptured with the knight. Remember, his king can't castle anymore. I'm going to go ahead and castle. So the way I do that is I pick up my king from its starting square, because my king hasn't moved yet during the game, and I'm going to move it 2 squares to one side. And then the computer moves the rook accordingly over there to d1. So my rook is now a second defender of the pawn there on d4. So my situation is looking fairly good now. A good tip, and this is something that good players will do almost instantly and almost automatically, that they will look at the board and they will figure out if any of their pieces are not being defended by any others. Okay, so let's just go through the white pieces right now, and then we'll go through the black pieces. Okay, this pawn here is okay because it's actually defended by that knight. All right, the king is defending that pawn and that pawn. That pawn on b2 is defending the knight. Right, the king is also defending the rook. The bishop is defending that pawn. That pawn is defending the bishop itself. However, and the rook is defending h2. The rook itself is not defended right now, and neither is that pawn on g2. These are the only pieces of mine that are currently undefended. So need to be aware of that. On the black side of the board, this pawn is not defended by any other piece. The rook technically is not defended, neither is this rook not defended, whereas the king is defending these and the rook is defending that. Okay, so there's 3 pieces, both rooks and a pawn, currently undefended. Alright, so my opponent's just played pawn a7 to a5. So he's maybe thinking about starting to launch an attack down the queen side of the board. I know my king is on that side, but this is the queen side, A, B, C, and D. Now what I need to be thinking about doing now is I want to control more of the board. I want to be able to put pressure on my opponent. And so in order to complete development, one thing I want to do is to get this knight into the middle of the board. Remember, knights are much more effective when they're in the middle of the board because they can control more squares. So I'm going to move this knight out now to f3. And now what you'll also see is that my rooks are now what we call connected. So my rooks are looking at each other. They've got a clear line of sight from one to the other. And what that means is that each rook is defending its partner. Okay? The rooks are now defending each other. So this whole back rank now is double defended by rooks. Alright, so my opponent's played his knight back out into the middle of the board. That makes sense. That's a reasonable move. So I'm going to start looking for opportunities now to come in and win material or do some damage. My opponent's king can't castle. It's stuck in the middle of the board. So I want to take advantage of that fact. What that is it's actually a weakness for my opponent. So how do I capitalize on this weakness? So I'm going to have a sip of tea and I'm going to think about it. Very, very, very important to take your time in chess. If I can give you one piece of advice for improving in chess, it's this. Always take your time. Taking your time is the answer to everything, right? When you think that there's a great opportunity, you can capture a queen or something like that, take your time and check. When there's something complicated and the board has just changed and the nature of the game has changed, take your time. And because of that, this is why I recommend, if you're beginning, then play these 60-minute time controls, or the shortest 30 minutes, right? Because what you need to do is, for every single move, look at the whole board, see what's defended, what's undefended, what's vulnerable, what's strong. You have to consider all of your possible moves, if you can. And there's quite often dozens of possible moves in chess. Some of them are clearly awful, so you can ignore them pretty quickly. But you want to consider more than one candidate move. And a candidate move is when you're thinking, okay, what are my options here? What are my ideas for my next move? So let's have a think about candidate moves now. King's in the middle of the board. I'm thinking one idea is rook from h to e1, where it's centralized and it's also lined up with my opponent's king. That is generally a good thing. I could move my knight there into the middle of the board to e5. That might then get into an exchange if he captures and I capture back with the pawn. Is there anything else for this knight to do? Could it come to here? Can't come to there because it could be captured by that bishop. What about this knight? Okay, this is interesting now. This knight can come either to b5 or d5, and from either of those squares it could then capture the pawn there on c7. And if it captures the pawn on c7, then my knight is on c7, then we've got this situation where it would be simultaneously attacking my opponent's king and my opponent's rook. And rooks are worth 5 points. Rooks are more important than knights. They get very, very powerful towards the end of the game. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my knight here to d5. And you see, another thing that I recommend that you do is don't drop the piece straight away, right? Hold it there, visualize, okay, this is how the board's going to look before I drop my piece. Is there anything, am I about to do something really stupid, really dumb, okay? So do this sanity check, okay? If I move my knight here, is it making something vulnerable? One thing that it's doing is that it means that there is no defender anymore of a2, so I might need to think about moving my king across at some point, okay? But no, I think this looks good. I'm going to drop my knight right there. So we're going to find out if my opponent spots this vulnerability. So when you have this situation, when you have one piece that is attacking two other pieces, that's known as a fork. Okay, so I'm attacking two pieces. Now, if I get there and if that king hasn't moved, then the king will be in check, and that means that the king must move. The king can't be captured, right? So if I play that, the king will be in check. There's nothing that can capture my knight from that square, and that means that when the king moves, either there, there, or there, I can then go ahead and capture the rook. Now, what my opponent has spotted is that this pawn is now undefended. So his knight has jumped in from the c6 square to the b4 square and is now attacking that pawn. Okay. Now, if you also notice, this is another fork. So that knight is attacking the a2 pawn and it's attacking my knight. So I've got options here. And what I need to do is I need to play through each scenario of how I might proceed and figure out in which scenario do I come out better. So, option 1, candidate move 1. I take his knight with my knight, at which point his pawn will almost certainly recapture. Okay, so I've won a knight, I've lost a knight. He will then have a pawn on this square, so he'll have what is known as doubled pawns. So he'll have two pawns on the b file, and that's generally weaker than having pawns on adjacent files. And the reason is because pawns that are on adjacent files can form those chains, like pyramids or lines, where each one is defending the one in front of it. Okay, so that's one option. Knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and then I would either have to move my king across to defend this pawn from the rook, or I'd have to move the pawn forwards to a3. So I don't win material that way. Option 2 is knight takes c7, which comes with check and does allow me to win the rook. Now, if I do that, then his next move has to be to move the king. Right? So the king is going to have to move to one of these squares, and then I can go ahead and capture the rook. When I capture the rook, I could have this knight come in and take a pawn, which would mean that I would then be in check, my king would be in check by his knight, and then I'll be forced to move my king, which I think is okay. So let's think about this. So I come in, I get a pawn with check, his king moves, I get a rook, so that means that I have now captured 6 points worth of material, because the pawn is worth 1 and the rook is worth 6. Okay, and if his knight comes in and he grabs a pawn, I've got 6 points, he's only got 1. 6 to 1. Okay, so I think that that is overall a better option. I'm not going to consider any other candidate ideas because I already had this one in my mind. I'm going to go in there, capture c7 with check, and next move, because his king's in check, he's going to have to move to one of these 3 squares, at which point I'm going to capture the rook. He may then come in and capture the pawn, and then my king will come across to kick the knight away again. So I'll see if my opponent agrees with that sequence of events. Okay, the king's come to d7. I'm going to go in, grab the rook. And indeed, he has come in with that. So I only have 2 legal moves at this point. I can move my king to d2, or I can move my king to b1. I think b1 is safer. I like the fact that my rook is defending this pawn, and I don't want to put my king in the way of that. So I'm going to move my king across there to b1. That is what we call kicking the knight. The knight is now going to have to move, or else my king will capture it on the next turn. Because black has no way of defending this knight. Okay, so the knight has to move. Now what I notice is that I have another fork. I have another knight fork. Can you see what this knight can do to attack 2 pieces on its next move? Okay, this is the move. Knight back to b6. Right? Back to b6. He's attacking the king's in check, and he's attacking that bishop. Okay, now here's a little tip. Knights and bishops are generally described as being worth 3 points each. Okay, now depending on the game, depending on the way the game has gone, depending on the way the board looks, that can really vary, because sometimes in some situations knights can be a lot more powerful than bishops. But in other types of situations, bishops can be really powerful and a lot more powerful than knights. And what we've got here is we've got a board that's actually quite open. We've already lost quite a lot of material off the board. And so there are plenty of empty squares, and there are lots of diagonals, right? Lots of free diagonals going on all over the board. So what that means is that this kind of board layout right now really favours bishops more than knights. So I think that my knight is going to be a less valuable piece than his light squared bishop later in the game. So I'm going to go ahead and capture that. He can't actually immediately recapture. If he'd have moved his king on the previous move, say to here, c7, that might have been a better move, so that when I come in and capture, the king can capture. But he's not done that, so he's lost his bishop without the ability to recapture my knight immediately. So one thing I notice he can do is he could move his bishop out to g7 or h6, which would then mean that his rook is attacking my knight. But if this bishop moves, okay, so he's done it a different way. So he's trying to attack now with the king. So I can capture that pawn there, I can go there, in which case I'll be taken. I can go here or here, okay? Either of these 2 squares is okay, there's no one attacking those. So I'm going to move to this one because it comes with check. Okay, so I'm forcing my opponent to react again. And my knight is now going to be able to escape. So I've managed to win that bishop without giving up any material of my own, which is great. And you can see in the corner here by my picture that chess.com has listed. It's actually showing you there the pieces that I've removed from the board, and it's showing you the pieces of mine that my opponent has captured as well. And it says here +10, right? And that +10 is the general value, the difference in value of what I've captured of my opponent's versus what he's captured of mine. So it's saying that I have captured, because I've got a rook and a knight and 2 extra pawns, they're worth about 10 points. Okay, so rook is worth 5, knight is worth 3, and 2 extra pawns is worth 2. So that's how it's got me at 10 points up. Doesn't mean you're going to win the game because you've got more points. The points isn't actually part of chess. It's just a mechanism that people use to, figure out the rough equivalent value of pieces. So I'm going to move my knight away from the king because I want to protect it. I'm also thinking at some point in time, I've got these 2 pawns here on a dark square, so I should probably move that pawn forward from c2 to c3, where it will then make a chain. Doing that would also attack the knight on b4 as well, so it would force that knight to move. It's generally a good idea to play these forcing moves that mean that your opponent is having to spend all of their moves reacting, getting out of the way, escaping, and doing things that they don't necessarily want to do. You want to stop them from being able to carry out their plans in the game as you are carrying out your plans. So let's see what my opponent decides to do. Moving my knight here, of course, also means that my knight is now looking at the pawn there on a5. So my opponent may need to think about how to come in there to protect the pawn. We will see. So what I was saying about the time controls earlier on, if you play 30-minute games, 60-minute games, that means that you've got 30 minutes or 60 minutes to make all of your moves, and so does your opponent. What you need to do is you need to give yourself enough time so that you can be sure, within the limits of your ability and experience and knowledge, okay, you need to be sure that you've got enough time to make the best moves that you can find on the board for each move, right? And so don't start chess by playing 5-minute or 10-minute blitz games. It really doesn't help. So and you can even play like 30-second games and ridiculous time controls. And these are only useful for more advanced players who want to hone their kind of instinctive skills, right? It really isn't a good way to improve your chess when you are learning the game. You can see now my opponent's resigned in this position. Is very a long way down on material and would really struggle to get a foothold in the game. So we didn't get to the end game, which is where we're really trying to checkmate the opponent, and we lost more of the piece off the board. But I hope that's been useful for you. We've covered some of the general rules of chess, we've covered some of the general principles, and I hope I've given you a few ideas that you can start to take away and apply into your own games. So good luck. Please do keep following Chess Bootcamp. I've got a lot of videos on there. I play games against people of different levels, and I show you some opening ideas and stuff like that. But generally, if you remember nothing else from this video, the most important rule is take your time and give yourself enough time so that you can play the best chess. You can make the best choices that you are capable of making, right? And that goes for absolutely everyone at pretty much every level of the game. So hope you enjoy it, and keep an eye out for new videos. See you soon.